Yeah, hey everyone, this is Mr. Davitt here. This is 1980s that we'll move into now. And really, the 1980s is going to be marked by a pretty significant trend as far as politics is concerned, which is a real big move to conservatism. And this is kind of conservatism that we probably haven't seen since about the 1920s. And so this kind of ushers in an era that, again, we really hadn't seen in quite some time. So I'll kind of remind you of some of the things that happened in the 60s and 70s that led to kind of a renewed focus on conservatism. And then I'll talk about the major characters, the major players, and then some of the big things that happened in the 1980s that somewhat unexpected by many stretches of the imagination, but working out for the United States. So, anyways, um, so let's start by looking at the election of 1980 itself and kind of the context and what's going to kind of happen here. So, as the election of 1980 is coming up, the Iranian hostage crisis still going on, and this led to huge unpopularity of Carter. Every night, the news would have a counter, how many days the hostages had been held, show other images of very much anti-Americanism taking place in Iran and things like that. So obviously not a good situation for Carter, as well as the economy had really soured as well. So that was obviously frustrating and problematic. If you think about it, also the 60s and definitely the 70s led to a mistrust in government. The Vietnam War really contributed that a lot. The American people had felt like the government really had steered them in the wrong direction and misled them in regards to Vietnam. And then the other big thing, obviously, would be Watergate and the decision by Gerald Ford to grant a pardon to Richard Nixon for any crimes he may have committed. So it's against kind of this context and against this background that it makes sense that we're going to see many that say this is the time for conservatism. This is a new kind of era for the United States. The person that's going to be the major leader of this conservative movement is going to be the Republican nominee, Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, originally an actor and then had turned politician. During his time as an actor, he helped rid communists from Hollywood. He then moved on to the governor of California and had kind of challenged Gerald Ford in 1976 for the Republican nomination, but they decided to go with Ford. At the time, Reagan's conservatism seemed a little too intense, but by 1980, enough things had kind of happened where more people were willing to kind of turn to him. Reagan made it pretty clear his ultimate goal was very much limited government. He made that very clear. He wanted to decrease the role of government. He wanted to decrease government spending, especially on social programs, and really kind of push that and really champion kind of this new idea. The Democrats going to really have a problem here. They're going to decide, or they're going to try to put up Ted Kennedy, brother of John and Bobby, both of which have been assassinated. The problem for Ted Kennedy, though, was years previous there was an accident up in Chappaquiddick. It was an automobile accident. It was his car. And there were some mysterious circumstances surrounding the death of a young lady. And although he wasn't necessarily directly connected or they didn't directly tie him to it, these scandal kind of lingered over him. And so the Democrats decided not to put him up, and instead they ended up putting up Carter. Reagan, very much a good campaigner, and really, because of Carter's unpopularity, all he really had to do was attack Carter. So he attacked Carter on the economy and foreign policy, both of which worked extremely well in conveying the fact that Carter had done a bad job. Sure enough, as to be expected, in 1980, Reagan achieved a massive victory, and we also see Republican control of the Senate. Kind of unfortunate for Carter. The economy was somewhat outside of his control. Obviously, the situation that developed in Iran, kind of outside of his control as well. Got a bad rap, but Post-presidency, he did well, even gaining the Nobel Prize, but just not exactly a great time for him to be president. So here's Reagan here. Here, by the way, is a look at the electoral map of 1980, and you can see what I'm talking about here, just how resounding of a victory this is, with both the popular and the electoral college vote. Clear victory for Reagan. And these are some quotes that Reagan had in regards to government. So government's not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. And then we see another one here. The most terrifying words in language are, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. You can think about how different that is compared to, really what had been the case since FDR, which was definitely government intervention, big government assistance, and things like that. We definitely see Reagan moving away from that as he takes over in 1980. So what are some components here of what some have called the Reagan Revolution, this major change in American politics, in the American economy? Well, first off, couldn't have had a better start to his presidency, because as he was getting inaugurated, the hostages were released finally after 444 days. So really, probably no presidents had a better start to their presidency. A huge problem that he would have inherited and had to have dealt with, and then it all kind of goes away. So that obviously gets things going on the right track for him. He's going to preach small government, and part of that, he says, we got to have less government spending. And again, like I showed you, rapid departure from the New Deal. Government's the problem, not the solution. Quite a different rhetoric than what we've seen before. He's going to develop a pretty strong relationship with the new British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, also incredibly conservative herself. And this is going to lead to a strengthening of the Anglo-American alliance between the United States and Britain. And kind of this idea that together, with free markets as well as less government, this is what would make the United States, Britain, etc., safer from communism. So kind of an interesting comparison, but something they thought as being necessary and effective. By 1980, because of the government scandals and because of government's kind of inability to fix problems, absolutely less government had become much more popular. And so Reagan was able to use this relatively well in order to get what he wanted done. In particular, huge cuts of government spending, in particular in social programs like food stamps and things like that. So this is what Reagan wanted to accomplish, and he was largely able to do so early on. So as we continue on, let's kind of talk specifically about Reagan's economic policies and kind of how he dealt with the budget. So first off, he's going to lower individual taxes, especially on big companies and big corporations. The type of economics that we subscribe, or what we say Reagan subscribed to, is known as supply side economics, which basically favors things like budgetary discipline and then tax reductions, especially for those at the top. And the reality is these tax cuts at the very top were meant to trickle down into the lower classes and thus raise everyone up. This is known as Reaganomics, and his name usually pushed to this because of kind of his implementation of this. There's also a couple other things he did which were somewhat unique to him in this kind of economic crusade. But early on, actually, Reaganomics will not lead to the economic success that Reagan had hoped and envisioned, and instead the U.S. economy will suffer a mild recession. Unemployment will go up, banks will fail, closing of businesses and things like that. This is not going to be very, very good at all. The other criticism that still is a criticism today of something like Reaganomics is that it really favors the rich. And that's definitely something this cartoon is trying to show, which is that the rich, they're going to get more money out of this because of less taxes for them. But this idea that it was going to trickle down to the middle class and the poor, not really actually the case. And so actually we'll see that later on when the wealth disparity between rich and poor will become extremely big. There will be economic recovery in 1983, but again, this comes with a widening economic income gap between the rich and the poor. Middle class will largely kind of stagnate, so that's not really a good thing. But for big businesses, for people who are on the wealthier side, these tax cuts absolutely help them become kind of more successful. Um, Although definitely Reagan's economic policy is to cut government spending, especially in areas of social programs, there's one area that he increases heavily in, which is defense spending. And this goes into something I'm going to explain just a little bit much more, but this is basically to increase the arms race with the Soviet Union, renew the Cold War, and win, really, the Cold War. This increase in arms spending and defense spending is going to lead to huge deficit spending, as the U.S. will basically become the biggest borrowers in the world economy in the 1980s. Okay, and here, by the way, is a look at the kind of four pillars of Reaganomics, basically everything I said there. But, reducing spending, reducing income and capital gains taxes, and then reducing government regulation. This is kind of us moving back to the idea of laissez-faire, definitely happening here through Reagan and Reaganomics. And here's our big cuts once again. And then this is all kind of his big plan. Okay, so let's talk about Nixon's approach to the Cold War. So first off, if you remember, Nixon had pushed détente. By the time Carter came in, détente was not necessarily as popular, actually, really at all. And Reagan, very much a committed anti-communist, and so he's going to decide that it is time to renew the Cold War and make it clear that the Soviet Union was the enemy. So he's going to even go as far as calling the Soviet Union the empire of evil. So even kind of reminding the American people, hey, we haven't forgot about these, this conflict. We haven't forgotten about the Soviet Union. And then the other thing that we're going to see here is that Reagan did believe that there did need to be negotiations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. But what's pretty interesting here is that he only wanted to negotiate if the U.S. had a position of dominance. So ensuring that the U.S. did was kind of his key thing. So that is the reason why Reagan will decide to make huge increases in the arms race, huge increases in military capabilities, and the arms race, which had kind of slowed because of SALT and other types of treaties, are going to basically be negated by this huge increase that's going to occur there. Reagan seized on a good opportunity because in the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was having a lot of internal economic issues. So Reagan believed that the Soviet Union would not be able to catch up and they would not be able to increase their military spending at the rate that the United States was doing so. Reagan even went as far as creating a new branch of military or government, which was the SDI, Space Defense Initiative. And this was basically the idea that there would be orbiting battle stations in space that could fire laser beams to vaporize missiles. The SDI never comes out, by the way. It is figured out that it was basically impossible to actually implement. However, by Reagan announcing his intentions for this program, he's effectively bringing the Cold War into space, something that, obviously would show another huge increase in the arms race here. So a pretty interesting development that we're looking at in this regard. This definitely is going to be a semi-gamble with Reagan renewing the arms race, because the reality is, if the Soviet Union did decide to try to kind of like match the United States, then, this would just lead to more and more U.S. spending, and the U.S. would not be able to negotiate from a position of dominance. But actually, this will work out as the Soviet Union will be unable to catch up. Certainly, though, at this point, definitely tensions are going to be building into levels that we really hadn't seen since something like the Cuban Missile Crisis or kind of the Cold War of the late 1940s, early 1950s. So that's what we're kind of looking at as this develops throughout this period. Here, by the way, is a cover of Time magazine depicting SDI. SDI was nicknamed Star Wars because of the movie that was around and had become pretty popular at the time. So much so that critics even would come up with something like this. The crack team of experts, we got the C3PO, the R2D2, and even ET joining in there. Again, this is a joke. But nonetheless, even though this plan is super ambitious and will not be able to come together, the reality is by announcing it and even just saying he was going to implement it, what we see is really Reagan's commitment to elevating the Cold War one step further. Okay, as all this is going on, there's also going to be other issues going on throughout the world that I'd like to talk about just briefly. First off, Reagan, anti-communist. Okay, you saw that with his viewpoint on the Soviet Union. But there's going to be other kind of flare-ups, and Reagan will decide to kind of get involved. First off, there's going to be a situation that develops in Lebanon. Reagan will send Marines into Lebanon. However, as they come in, some are killed, and they will not be able to bring peace to this conflict going on in Lebanon, the Lebanese Civil War. So, kind of an interesting predicament here where the United States sends in troops, but it doesn't quite fix any of the issues or any of the problems. Okay, in Nicaragua, there was a group that had come to power in the later 1970s, which were known as the Sandinistas. And the Sandinistas were definitely a leftist group. They were anti-American, anti-West by all intents and purposes. When they had initially come to power, Carter tried to kind of have relations with them, but Reagan makes it very clear he will not have relations with the Sandinistas and actually wants them to be gotten rid of. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit on how exactly the United States is going to semi-involve themselves in that. Reagan will also send military advisors to help a pro-U.S. government of El Salvador. And then in another situation, the United States will send troops into the tiny Central American country of Grenada when insurgents try to take over and implement communism. So just a lot of kind of flare-ups going on, especially in Latin America and a little bit in the Middle East. And Reagan definitely wants to influence outcomes in these areas and is going to do what he can in order to make this happen. This image, by the way, is some U.S. troops in Grenada. And then here we see Carter actually with the leaders of the Sandinistas after they had taken power in Nicaragua. And many criticized Carter for trying to maintain friendly relations, but that was part of his kind of overall policy. He felt that, and by the way, the regime that they overthrew was definitely one that was corrupt and pretty bad. So this is what he thought was good. He gave them aid. He set up diplomatic relations. But basically, as soon as Reagan took over, not wanting to do that, and I love this picture of Reagan, stop communism in Central America, because it really shows that was Reagan's commitment always. Okay, he was very much anti-communist. He very much saw communism as being a very evil and very anti-American ideology. So this shirt, I like that. And here, by the way, are some quotes showing Reagan's commitment to anti-communism. Communism works only in heaven where they don't need it, and in hell where they've already got it. And this one here, how do you tell a communist? It's someone who reads Marx and Lenin. how do you tell an anti-communist someone who understands Marx and Lenin? So I think that's kind of fascinating. So let's talk about Reagan's second term and what's going to occur. So first off, re-election in 1984. It's barely even worth talking about because you can see here from this image, it's just not even close. And the Democratic opponent, Walter Mondale, gets 10 electoral college votes from Minnesota and then 3 from District of Columbia. And that's it. Everywhere else goes to Reagan. So showing that by 1984, people still liked conservatism. People still liked Reagan. They liked his program. They liked his energy. They liked his enthusiasm. And so this shows that. Also, look at the popular vote, a resounding victory there as well. Definitely domestic policies, the economy, and things were the focus of Reagan's first term, but Reagan's second term is going to be a lot about foreign policy. And a lot of that is going to have to do with happenings in the Soviet Union. So in 1985, right as Reagan is, into a second term, the Soviets are going to select a new leader by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev. And previous Soviet leaders, although different, did a lot of things similar, which was that they were kind of old school, they were old fashioned, they kind of subscribed to the old Soviet system. They did not allow for any improvements, any reforms, anything like that. Mikhail Gorbachev was going to be different. He was seen as kind of being more friendly. He was seen as being more open to things going on in the Soviet Union. And so when he takes over in 1985, he's going to say, you know what? What we've been doing is not working. Okay, economy's in crisis. There's all these uprisings. The people of the Soviet Union don't even like being under our control. And all we do is we just send in troops and, crush them and whatever else. And so we can't do that. So he's going to implement 2 major reforms that are really going to change the trajectory for the Soviet Union and for the Cold War. The first reform is glasnost. This means openness. This is Gorbachev's plan for allowing some levels of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, even some criticism of the Communist Party for really the first time in the existence of the Soviet Union. And then the other reform is an economic reform, which is perestroika, economic restructuring. And this is meant to put some levels of free market capitalism. Not a lot, but just a little bit to get things going and get things together. These 2 policies were just meant to reform the Soviet Union and make things better. However, what's really going to happen is these 2 reforms are going to require the Soviet Union to heavily shrink their size of their military, and it's going to help lead to the end of the Cold War. Against this backdrop, Reagan and Gorbachev will actually meet. They meet in 1985. They meet in 1986. Nothing too substantial. But in 1987, they sign an INF treaty banning all of these particular nuclear missiles. So that was huge development there. And then in 1988, there was a summit at Moscow. This summit basically established, decent relations with the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and essentially is going to bring the Cold War to conclusion. And again, really, both of these events would be considered big for history and for the way things work themselves out. Okay, so here we see Gorbachev featured on the cover of Time and the cover of Newsweek as he takes over in the Soviet Union. Again, seen as, young. Well, he definitely was younger than the other ones, but also seen as somebody that was, a little more formidable and a little more, willing to kind of open things up. And also somebody that definitely looked at the existence of what was going on in the Soviet Union saying, this isn't working. We're going to have to make changes or else this is going to be a complete nightmare. And here we see Reagan and Gorbachev. It's funny, when we talk about Reagan, we talk about somebody that started off his time by saying, hey, communism's horrible, evil empire, whatever, and then realizing when it was time to negotiate that he comes together with Gorbachev, and they make some really, really substantial progress. And here we see the two here once again. Here they signed the INF Treaty. So when we talk about Reagan, we talk about a president that's pretty successful and is pretty popular, but there is a relatively big controversy that happens underneath him, so I do want to share that with you. So first off, there's a few things that I have to explain that are going to help explain why this scandal kind of breaks out, which is known as the Iran-Contra scandal. First off, there were U.S. hostages in Lebanon in the 1980s that the United States was trying to get released, but having some trouble doing so. Okay. Across the globe in Central America, the Sandinistas, that leftist group that I was talking about earlier, were in power in Nicaragua. And the United States and Reagan did not want the Sandinistas in power. And there was a group known as the Contras, and the Contras were fighting against the Sandinistas for control in Nicaragua. So Reagan wanted Congress to authorize aid to give to the Contras to be more successful in their fight against the Sandinistas. Congress said no. Okay, said not our business, not really where we need to be right now, etc. So the Reagan administration, being kind of upset about this, they're going to make kind of another deal where they hope that they can achieve their goals, but do so sort of secretly. And this is when what's going to happen is the United States will secretly create an arms deal with Iran. And this was technically illegal, as the United States had an embargo with Iran because of the Iranian Revolution. But they hoped that because Iran was in a war with Iraq, they definitely needed these weapons, and that Iran could negotiate on behalf of the United States with Lebanon in order to get the hostages released. Now, this money could not just come back to the United States from the sale of weapons to Iran because of the embargo, and it was illegal money. So the United States decided that they would actually give the profits to the Contras, and this way they could still get the money, but this would be done in a much more secretive way. In 1986, this news was broken about what was going on within the Reagan administration, and Reagan is going to claim he did nothing wrong, but still a lot of controversy, as some people were saying, oh gosh, it's, Watergate all over, oh my gosh, this distrust of government and whatever else. Well, the good news actually is that, at least for Reagan, is that as they do an investigation, they're going to figure out that, or they're going to determine that Reagan should have known what was going on. It was bad kind of oversight and leadership by him. However, they're going to say it didn't look like he was directly involved. So this scandal had the potential to possibly really tarnish and really ruin his popularity, but it's not going to occur, and he will still remain very popular here. Okay, so other than Reagan and his administration and their conservatism, there's some other big conservative things that are going to be going on when we talk about the 1980s. So one's going to be the rise of a group that we call the religious right. This Jerry Falwell, he's going to call this group the moral majority, and really this is a group of televangelists who are going to reach a massive viewership of millions through their preaching on radio, TV, direct mail, etc. And these televangelists will collect millions of dollars and become extremely powerful and influential people. The group of the religious right that comes out here is going to be labeled as pro-life or Christian voters, and this is the idea here that they're going to really focus on social issues as opposed to economic issues and things like that. This group is really going to change the composition of the Republican Party, because for a long time the Republican Party was made up of people that were basically financially conservative, challenging the heavy government role in the economy and stuff like that. But now we have a situation where the Republican Party is going to be a lot more about moral and pro-life voting and other things like that. So pretty interesting that the Republican base is going to really change as a result of this. As far as the courts are concerned, definitely conservatism under Reagan, as he will name conservative judges to the court. Best example of that would be Sandra Day O'Connor, who actually becomes the first female Supreme Court justice in U.S. history. Some cases in the 80s will rule against affirmative action, basically making it harder to prove racial discrimination in the hiring of somebody. So for people that were opposed to affirmative action, that was a big victory, definitely for them. And in Webster versus Reproductive Health Services, another victory for conservatives, as states could have some say in who had access to abortions. And what this basically meant was they couldn't necessarily ban it altogether, but they could require minors to notify their parents. They could, restrict access after a certain amount of time and other things like that. So if you're talking about the pro-life versus pro-choice, definitely see that tension building as a result of a lot of these decisions in the 1980s. And here's Sandra Day O'Connor. Okay, so it's now time to be done with Ronald Reagan and his presidency. Again, extremely popular, even though in the later part of the 80s, some economic issues. Actually, in October of 1987, largest one-day fall of the stock market up to that point. And that's obviously relevant because that one-day loss has been outmatched by a lot of the ones that have been going on because of the COVID crisis. The Democrats in 1988 are going to put up Michael Dukakis, and the Republicans are going to go with George H.W. Bush, who was Reagan's vice president. And they decide to kind of go this way because still Reagan was popular, good legacy, and they say, let's build on that and let's see if we can capitalize. The strategy works out well. H.W. Bush wins, and as you can tell here from the map, it's a pretty, resounding victory, which shows that still by 1988, a lot of love for Ronald Reagan still, a lot of love for his kind of brand of conservatism and conservatism kind of as a whole that we'll see take place here. So officially, when we have H.W. as president, those things that Reagan and Gorbachev put into place will successfully end and dismantle the Cold War. So I'll talk about China. In China, in 1989, there were pro-democracy protests taking place in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. These were meant to shed light on corruption of Chinese government officials, also meant to say, hey, we want more openness from the government. We want, to be kind of democratic. And the result of this is that troops will be brought in and will kill the protesters, and really kind of an ugly scene. Here you see one image here. This one's very famous. This is Tank Man. These are tanks in the streets in order to push away what were peaceful protesters. HW is not going to take tough action against China. No one really throughout the world will. The reality is by 1989, China's trade was just so beneficial for the United States. The United States did not want to kind of anger them. So there was a little bit of scolding and criticism, but nothing really concrete. Normal relations remained. In 1989, what also is going to happen kind of magnificently is many revolutions throughout Eastern Europe that will effectively end communism and end Soviet satellite rule in these places. The Berlin Wall will fall as well. Really, the Berlin Wall, not only that barrier of Berlin and of Germany, but also really a sign of division and really a sign of the Cold War. So when that goes down, that's really going to be a huge deal and a really big sign of new relations. Gorbachev will become unfavorable, and he will resign as the Soviet premier. And basically, what we're going to see is that the Soviet Union will be no longer. The 15 republics that make it up will become independent and will loosely align themselves in the CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States. The biggest one by far is going to be Russia itself, and the new president of Russia will be Boris Yeltsin. And at least initially, Russia will make some attempts to democratize, some reforms, and some elements of free market economy. For many, the Cold War ending like this was really sort of strange. Many had predicted that either the Cold War would kind of violently end and be really, it would be a heavy struggle. Many believe that the Cold War and the United States and the Soviet Union as the two superpowers would last for a very long period of time, and that's not what happens. And instead, it just kind of ends, not necessarily totally peacefully, but somewhat quickly, somewhat easily, as this whole thing comes to play. The Cold War and its end means democracy has won, which is obviously great. The U.S. remains as the sole superpower, but it also turns into kind of this question of what was next for U.S. foreign policy. What was going to be kind of the next step of the equation here? And that was kind of a big question. And I'll kind of talk about that a little bit, and then we'll look at that more in the next lesson. So here are some of the images out of Eastern Europe. This is Poland. Here we see the Berlin Wall, and finally we see it breaking apart. Finally, the people of East Berlin can travel freely into West Berlin and West Germany. And hopefully you know this, Berlin will become one and united, as will Germany. And here's that same picture, but this one's in color, so you can see it a little bit better. Okay, so not too long after all this, the U.S. is going to have kind of its first foreign policy deal, which was outside of the Soviet Union, really outside of the context of the Cold War, and outside of fighting to contain communism. So this is going to be in the first Gulf War. So the leader of Iraq, a guy by the name of Saddam Hussein, is going to make the decision to invade a neighboring country, Kuwait, which was an oil powerhouse. And Iraq had been fighting a war against Iran. They had racked up a lot of debts. They didn't really know how to pay it, so they decided they were just going to come into Kuwait and take oil in order to be able to do so. Okay, U.S. going to say, no, we can't, you can't do that. And so U.S. is going to mobilize forces and deploy them for a big kind of military action against Saddam in Iraq. This, by the way, is the first major conflict the U.S. will participate in where it's going to be an all-voluntary military. So after Vietnam, kind of this idea, not going to have a draft again, draft didn't work out, so much anger and resentment, the military is going to be all-volunteer at this point, and that's exactly what's going to happen here as it does become an all-volunteer force. We're going to see an air attack against Iraq starting here. The initial deployment is mostly pilots and, those type of people. And other countries, including countries of the Arab world, will also participate, which is really interesting. But this is mainly U.S.-led. Pretty big show of American force, but the big show of American force comes with a land war that begins, known as Operation Desert Storm, where we'll actually see troops on the ground coming into Iraq, and within 4 days, just 4 days, some will surrender and be forced to leave Kuwait. With this surrender, again, really big show of military might. Iraq's forced to leave Kuwait, etc. And a lot of Americans pretty impressed with the kind of military dominance that the U.S. had during this thing. However, the United States allows Saddam to remain in power with some kind of asterisks, and he has to be subject to weapons inspections and things like that. But the other thing the United States does, whether or not they realized it or not, in 1991 by involving themselves in this, was that now they're going to involve themselves deeper into the chaos, conflict, and tension of the Middle East. And so that's going to become a lot more challenging when we hit at the beginning of the 21st century. Okay, here, by the way, are some of these U.S. planes that are going to be in the big deployment. Here's HW as kind of wartime commander. And again, though, popularity out of this situation. Again, a lot of U.S. dominance, easy kind of victory for the most part. So definitely this was kind of probably one of the more promising parts of HW's presidency. And here, by the way, we see Operation Desert Storm and our ground troops. Okay, so let's talk about Bush at home, and then we'll call this a day. Under Bush, we will see the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, signed in 1990, which prohibited discrimination against Americans with physical or mental disabilities. So big step. And by the way, ADA still exists today. You might be familiar with the ADA because when you go to a store, you go to a restaurant, there's a certain number of handicapped parking spots, for example. That's something that's come out of the ADA. So really good stuff and other protections and other things like that. HW will have the opportunity to nominate a Supreme Court justice. He nominates Clarence Thomas, who was African American, but actually was opposed to affirmative action and was extremely conservative. So HW picked a very conservative person to fill the bench. As he is looking to get confirmed, sexual harassment claims from a woman by the name of Anita Hill will come out against Clarence Thomas. And just like a lot of these things, the news will be around. They'll be covering this, hearing the testimony of Anita Hill. Clarence Thomas will deny any wrongdoing, anything like that. And at the end of the day, Clarence Thomas is going to be actually appointed, confirmed, even amidst this kind of controversy. And up to 2020, today, Clarence Thomas is still on the Supreme Court and is actually the longest serving current justice on the Supreme Court. However, Bush is going to have some problems, which are going to be economic issues that are really going to impact his presidency. Unemployment will reach about 7%. Budget deficits will get higher and higher. And then the other thing that he does that probably kind of is the nail on the coffin for HW is that he implements new taxes. And when he does so, he's going to break away from campaign promises where he really said, hey, I'm not going to, no new taxes, etc. But the economic situation required him to do so. But that's definitely going to make him lose credibility, legitimacy, and things like that. So that's going to be kind of what takes place here. Okay, here, by the way, is Clarence Thomas on the left, Anita Hill on the right. Okay, and then I've shown you this before, but here's our presidents. Again, let's look now specifically for Reagan. Reagan coming in the top 10 in both of these. And then you can find HW. He's a little bit later on the list, 20th in this one on the left. And HW doesn't go down as necessarily a bottom half. He's kind of right around the middle-ish. And that's because, First Gulf War is obviously impressive. The ADA certainly impressive also. But the economic issues really hurt HW and definitely put kind of a sour note on his presidency. Okay, so thanks a lot. I actually only have one big lesson left where I'll do the 90s into today. And then that'll be it. So thank you very much, and talk to you soon.